We're here with Jonathan Holstein at the Abstract Design in American Quilts exhibition. It's June 8th, 2021, and we're delighted to have Jonathan here to share his stories about the creation of the collection and the creation of this exhibition. So, start from the beginning, tell us everything.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I couldn't imagine a better place to spend part of the summer, thank you. And I love this picture of Gail and I think I'll start not with a quilt story, but with a personal story. Because Gail and I were a funny pair because she was 2 inches taller than I. And once walking on a beautiful day in the streets of New York, an 8 or 9-year-old boy holding his mother's hand looked at us and said, "Stop!" So he stopped and he looked at Gail and he looked at me and he looked back at Gail and said, "Are you his mother?" So I thought, oh my God, perceptions. So this was taken in our apartment after we had begun to collect, and more or less there were just rows of quilts you had to walk between to get any place. And I would love to walk through the incredible installation you have done with those quilts, and to see some of those old friends again are just amazing.
So before we move to the gallery, tell us a little bit more about how you two collected quilts.
Well, we both had a background in art, but very different. Gail had actually studied art and created art on her own, and I was always, even as a child, was very interested in collecting or amassing. Maybe it's a better term for it. And I was very interested in early American life. So when Gail joined me in New York, we had met in Aspen, we were visiting friends of ours who lived in Pennsylvania. Actually, they were psychiatrists who thought the country life was going to be good for them. And we would visit them on weekends. And we didn't have to go to movies because every weekend in Pennsylvania, there were amazing quilt shows, antique shows. And we just would have fun going through them. We weren't buying that much, but we were having a good time. And we began to see piles of pieced quilts, which there was no interest in, unless people wanted cheap, colorful bed covers. So we began to look through them, and slowly we began to see quilts that reminded us of the art most of our friends were making in New York. Most of our friends were in the art world, both older people like Barnett Newman and his wife, and younger people like Lichtenstein and his wife. They were just good friends. And we were also seeing Jackson Pollock's work and everyone, Yves Klein, everyone else you can think of. And we went, oh my God, these look so much like modern abstract paintings. And the more we looked at, the more amazed we became. And the intellectual side of it was understanding that American women, untrained as artists, but instinctively had produced some of the most striking modern art images similar to modern painting it just was unparalleled. So at that point we began to spend way too much time and money buying quilts. And at one point we thought, well, this can't just be Pennsylvania, it must be. So we started, in our Volkswagen van, we started going around the rest of the country. New England first, of course, and we found the same thing. Not as many as in Pennsylvania, but very similar. And then we went several times across country, following not the superhighways, just stopping at antique shops, and began to realize that it was a country-wide phenomenon and not just an Eastern one. So we just kept collecting until one day we said, this is ridiculous. We have to introduce the rest of the world to this amazing accomplishment. And that began the story that brought us to the Whitney.
Yeah.
This is a wonderful quilt that my brother's wife found in an antique shop in Denver, Colorado, after I was going to Aspen a lot in those times when where he lived, and she became interested in what Gail and I were doing. Her name is also Gail. And she found this quilt, and this is the one that was the lead-in at the Whitney. It was in the lobby, and it's the first one people saw, which alerted them to the fact that there were these striking textiles hanging on the wall. The way it got to the Whitney, the art world was a smaller place then than it is now. I went to a friend of ours whose husband was a painter and who worked at the Guggenheim as a curator, and she got us an appointment with Mac Doty, who was curator of the Whitney. So I called Mac, and he, as a courtesy, I'm sure he thought, oh my God, do I really have to do this? As a courtesy, he made an appointment. So he said, bring some slides, and I said to Gail, he grew up in Connecticut. He knows quilts, and he's going to say, thank you very much, I know what quilts are. I said, so let's take a duffel bag of quilts. So we picked some of the most striking, like that one. And that's exactly what happened. He said, I grew up around quilts, I know quilts. I said, would you look at a few? And so we held up 5 or 6, and he said, give us a proposal. So we did, thinking, oh, well, that was that. And we were in Mexico when we got a telegram saying, could you have a exhibition ready by this summer? And we said, yeah. So we raced back, and that began the odyssey that ended with the Whitney show.
Tell us the story of how you picked them and put them together from the widow's walk of your friend's house.
Right. The Lichtensteins had a house, painter Roy and his wife Dorothy, had a house in the Hamptons. And we were visiting, I thought, oh my God, because it had the lawn surrounded the house, and there was a widow's walk or a roof walk. So we took out about 100 quilts. It was a beautiful spring day, a nice dry lawn, and we spread them out all around the house. And Rory had 2 sons, and we would say, move that one, etc. So eventually we narrowed it down to the 60 around that we thought were appropriate for what we wanted to accomplish at the Whitney. And the amazing thing is that the Whitney, I didn't realize this until years later, the amazing thing about it was that the Whitney never asked to see what they were getting. They did not know what show they were getting until the day we arrived with the quilts and started spreading them out. And that, of course, is unheard of for a museum. But they were thinking, we don't know anything about quilts, why should So I would like to show you maybe the first quilt that we hung at the Whitney. And the Whitney was marvelous because they had bays, they had movable walls so we could make bays. So the second floor, we could break up the second floor and make more hanging space, and that was how we could put up, because quilts are big, and that was why we could hang so many on one floor. This one, as I remember, so we had these art handlers at the Whitney hanging the quilts, and we decided to look at all the sight lines and balance out the sight lines. And we thought, well, what is going to be after seeing that circles and crosses in the lobby, what is going to be the first quilt people see as they walk in? First big quilt. And we decided on this one. And we had not hung any quilts at that point. So the art handlers, as I said, were all artists, and everyone, the museum staff was waiting to see what this was going to look like, understandably. And we hung the first quilt. We had devised this hanging method with sleeves, and they were rolled up, and we got it hung, and we let it go down the wall, and everyone went, oh! And I said, Gail, it worked. If there's more of those, we have a good show. And that's eventually what happened. So we tried to pick a show that showed, most of them are 19th century, but some are early 20th, but that showed the breadth of design, but incorporated fantastic visions abstract visions. Things like this one behind you, which repeated images of what we think is a schoolhouse or a church. But I think it's a schoolhouse. And why they did repeated images like this, we don't know. But there's another one on this wall that I also love. There's just baskets. And this was a not uncommon image, a not uncommon thing to do. These simple geometric forms that everyone recognized as baskets because they were a part of American folk art. People who knew folk art knew that these were baskets. But of course, it's also what Andy Warhol was doing at that time with soup cans, etc. So that gave people an interesting link to what was going on in New York at the time. This quilt was an enigma even for us, even after I mean, who could have designed this? What was she thinking? It's just an extraordinary piece of abstract art. The other thing I really like about it is that the back, see, I have on a glove, which is absolutely de rigueur. It's a very simple pieced quilt that she made, and rather than using a backing, spending money on material for backing, she used a lot of random pieces and then brought it around as the border. So you're seeing this funny kind of border on this very simple, elegant design. But I love that her placement was amazing. Cutting off the tops of some, cutting off the sides of others. It's just a phenomenal visual treat. And that's what we were finding, you know, to go to Pennsylvania and every trip find something like this was unparalleled fun. And this was really particularly Pennsylvania. The use just simply of red on white was an extraordinary idea, rather than this kind of incredibly busy work in this log cabin. We contrasted this incredible simplicity and power of these red on white quilts. And the stripes aren't even the same size, and it doesn't make any difference. It just works well. And there's another one over here on this wall. Same thing, also from Pennsylvania. Although the museum is very cautious, as it should be, and says possibly from Pennsylvania.
You know, we're always using possibly and probably to make sure that we don't put any ideas in people's heads of things that we don't know as absolute fact.
All right, so this is another example of amazing abstract design, just using just red and white. And it moves, it shifts visually, which some of these quilts do, and for instance, the one next to it does the same thing. As you look at it, it shifts back and forth because of the really brilliant, it's a three-dimensional effect because of the brilliant placement of light, medium, and dark in each cube. And because of that, they pop this way and that way. And that was, again, a phenomenon that American quilt makers discovered and exploited. Again, you've got this interesting visual phenomenon, things advancing and receding. This quilt is about what? 1900, 1910 maybe, could be as late as 1920, I think more 1910. And you have the same manipulating visual phenomena, which quilt makers did, and did brilliantly. No one taught it to them, they discovered it on their own. And right next to it, we see again this incredible Pennsylvania simplicity. But it's also very visual. It comes forward and back. But to make a large rectangular painting like this in just two colors is a phenomenal thing. But they did it. And these are interesting because they're among, this one and another one we'll look at in a minute, are among the most reproduced of any of the quilts in the collection, right? And if you ask me to explain why this one is so incredibly appealing to people, I don't know, except we have this wonderful visual movement, and then this compressed, intensely focused, crazy strip in the middle. It was just somewhat, it's just jammed there. And I think people unconsciously react to the tension, the visual tensions. It just works. Not every quilt works, but then the ones that work really well are brilliant. I love this quilt. And there's one other, the other one that has been a world champ is this one. And again, it's got some interesting phenomena. It's a 9-patch quilt. And she just used up her materials, and when she got down there, she had to change it a bit to make it work. But for some reason, this is one of the favorite quilts in the collection. So people who are not necessarily attuned to modern abstract art, for instance, intuitively recognize the genius of this painting, this cloth painting. And it's been reproduced all over the world on book covers, etc. Should I show the back?
Sure. That beautiful stripe.
It's a flannel back that she bought in a store, a whole cloth flannel back to finish her beautiful quilt.
So Jonathan, talk to us a little bit about the press that came out. I mean, this show was so amazingly received in many art worlds. Also had some real strong opposition to it. But what did it feel like when people responded to this show?
Well, we were given the ultimate prize right at the start when then the dean of New York art critics, which means the dean of United States art critics, Hilton Kramer, wrote this amazing review. I suppose later I'll quote a little bit of it. In any case, he got it. He said something about the hinterlands of the United States having produced images which in many ways preceded the same kind of visual phenomenon developed by modern abstract artists. That's not exactly what he said, but that was the thing. And he just said he said the overall quality is so extraordinary that I won't pick out any particular ones. And I thought, okay, that's it.
So did you and Gail go out and celebrate? Were you like, oh, they got it, we love this? What was your feeling about it?
Well, we were so convinced. We just thought this has to go on, and it did. What's our next job? So it went from the Whitney to the Everson in Syracuse, then to a museum in Minneapolis, their Walker Art Center for Modern Art, and then to the LA County Museum. And then we started getting requests from abroad. It went to France and Belgium, etc., and finally Japan. So this just kept happening. We didn't have time to breathe much, which was fine, because it had a worldwide impact pretty quickly. And people, at the initial thing, people in the Midwest were calling us, people who wrote columns for Midwestern newspapers, after they'd seen Hilton Kramer, and then other critics picked up on it, and saying, what's going on here? What is it about quilts? But it became, at that point, the largest visited show the Whitney had ever had. And they didn't really want to print a catalog, so we printed a little paper catalog, 3,000. They think they were $1. Can you believe that? They were $1. And they sold out like the first couple of days. That was it. So if you have one, you're lucky. This is another of those extraordinary Pennsylvania red and white quilts. I wish I knew where and how it started, but I don't. But when Gail and I first began to study these quilts, these are the ones that we just couldn't believe. They're the ones that kept us, this kind of quilt, with this kind of visual power, were the ones that just kept us at it. And no one else did it. like as they did it in Pennsylvania, and again, I have no idea why. This was it. This was the first Amish quilt we ever saw, except we had no idea it was an Amish quilt. By the time we came across this, we'd been collecting several years, and we had a route through Pennsylvania which had been productive. Certain dealers would then start holding quilts for us, but others just had a particular eye, and they were going to tag sales and house sales and buying all the quilts. So we would make sure that we went on our route each day, each time we were there. And there was a school teacher who had a antique shop in what had been a one-room schoolhouse that he only had open in the summer because he couldn't afford the heat in the winter. So we stopped to see him. Hi, how are you? Gail was talking to him, and I went upstairs, and there was a brass bed with this over the springs. And I went, I wish you could see the whole thing, but it has this beautiful green border, and it's visually it's still my favorite Amish quilt. So I said, Gail, would you mind coming up here for a minute? And she came upstairs, and I said, oh my God, look at this, some demented angel. Yeah, all right, calm down, calm down. Let's go down and talk to him. So we went downstairs, and I said, you know, that quilt up there, oh, well, no, he said, you got to buy it. That's just covering the springs. You got to buy the bed. I said, well, you know, look at it. We sleep in this van. We can't possibly carry a brass bed, and we certainly don't need it in New York. Can't you just sell me the quilt? And he said, okay, the bed and the quilt is $11. But if you just take the quilt, you've got to pay me a little more. So the quilt is $5.75. And that's the first Amish, but we did not know it was Amish. And the other reason I raised the money is not because it was that cheap. It's because it's hard for people to understand now what small amounts of money meant then. For instance, when I look through our field journal, I see quilts, $16.85, $23.45. And it's hard to get people to accept that 45 cents meant something to someone at that point. In any case, so we began to carry this around when we went places and saying, does anyone know who could have made this? And finally someone said, oh yeah, that's antique. He said, that's one of those terrible old Amish dark quilts. No one wants them. And I went, I have died and gone to heaven. When we found this, we couldn't quite believe it until someone said, oh yeah, this was a Victorian technique still called puff quilts. When women were doing things that had dimension. And we knew that this was like the kind of art that was beginning to develop where things were coming off the wall, where young artists were beginning to experiment with different kinds of assemblages, which had three-dimensional effect. But we'd never seen it in a quilt, and I thought this was absolutely brilliant. The fact is, it's not very warm. It was meant from the beginning to be a visual phenomenon. And that also intrigued us, that someone would have sat and made this day after day after day just because it was visually interesting. And then we went, okay, that's what a lot of quilting is about. That was a great revelation for us. Well, this quilt, which again is from Pennsylvania and probably would not have been made anyplace else. And there's several reasons for that. The first, I think it's called Jacob's Coat of Many Colors, is one of the names for it. And again, just a brilliant piece of work, but the simplicity that many Pennsylvania quilt makers liked. And a noted feminist writer who did not like the Whitney show particularly because she said that we had successfully taken wonderful women's art and given it into the hands of the largely male-controlled art institution. And she said, and that we had not given, unlike showing paintings, we had refused to give the names of the makers of these things. Well, the point was they didn't come with any names. They were just being bought in house sales by antique dealers. And I remember one auction we went to where there was a big bureau with those huge, 1830s Empire bureau with the huge drawers, and it was filled. Every drawer was filled with quilts, and the auctioneer said, "Bureau, selling a bureau. Anyone who buys it gets the quilts." I mean, that was literally what they had thought of it. So we never could put names with most of them. That it wasn't worth the dealer's time to collect them. After a certain point it was, because provenance equals value, money, for dealers. But she said, even look at, typically, there it is signed by the maker, and they wouldn't even put that on the museum wall. Well, that is not a maker's name. Men in Pennsylvania had stencils, and they stencil everything, down to their dogs practically, their axe handles, their carts, etc. And this quilt was made for this man, and he put his name on it. But the funny thing is that it was in a place which makes it look like a sign painting. This quilt we put near the entrance to the Whitney show. It was made for a child in circumstances of probably significant poverty. It's made from feed sacks, but the mother did these wonderful stitched designs to give it some life for a child. And it's pretty ragged and beat up, but it's an extraordinary piece of visual work. And I wanted to show at the entrance to the exhibition, we wanted to show that it didn't all depend on color, that it depended on these women's amazing eye for form, line, position, and not just color. So this was one of the first ones you saw when you entered the exhibition. I wanted to look at this one for a second because scale is very important in quilts, as it is in all art. And here was a mother making a quilt for a child's bed, or a crib. This is actually like a crib size. And she used a traditional pattern, but knew how to scale it down to make a kind of incredible piece of visual phenomenon that works in scale, just as painters know how to go from a small canvas to a big canvas. But that was important for us as a lesson to learn that quilt makers were scaling up and down just the way other artists were. The log cabin pattern and its variations, like the very different variations of them that are architectural, we don't really know if it came from a log cabin or not, or how it got that name. But the very complex quilts with very fine small pieces have to be incredibly carefully planned to work visually. And some of them make it, like this one. This is the courthouse steps. This variation is called courthouse steps, with the entrance, the frieze, the tab at the top, and columns. And then this one up here is the more traditional log cabin. Again, we don't know if it was inspired by the logs of a cabin or if in fact someone gave it that name. But traditionally, they very often had a red center to center each block individually. It was a very interesting trick, and you can see that a lot of in this variation did the same thing of visually centering a red block. We looked at, a few minutes ago, we looked at a white and red baskets quilt, and I wanted to show you how the same design could be used in so many different ways. You saw just that very simple red basket, but here is a very abstract basket design. This one's we don't know about that red and white, I'm not sure how to date that, probably about 1900. This one's earlier, this is 1880s. Beautiful 1880s fabrics. This was a woman who could afford to buy good materials specifically to make a quilt. We see these beautiful whole cloths of the period. how she got her materials, of course, we don't exactly know. But the point was that the same designs could be manipulated by different women to make very different effects. Here's another log cabin quilt which shows the incredible variation that design could produce. This woman decided, I'm not going to use red centers, I'm going to use blue centers. But it works the same way, and this one is the log cabin rather than the courthouse steps use of that design. Very powerful, serene, powerful quilt. And here's another one, again, showing how varied these designs, the same design could make very varied results. But this woman did use the red center, and this one is courthouse steps. There's the steps to the door and the frieze over the top, and here are the columns. So I suppose that's an apt title, but I have no idea who in fact developed it. And then I wanted to talk about this one for a second to show again the sense of scale. This is a nice early quilt. These are 1850s, 60s materials, and that's about how old I think this quilt is, probably 1860s. And English fabrics, could be some French ones in there, but probably all English. But again, showing how the image, the design could be scaled down and up to create a very powerful central image and a very successful whole painting, as it were. Here's another log cabin quilt. We've moved forward about 50, 75 years here, and you can see that these patterns were handed down from quilt maker to quilt maker, and in families, and in pattern books, and in women's magazines. And these very successful designs were not confined to a single small period, but, and women are still making log cabin quilts. So again, it shows the continuity of the enterprise from, we decided at one point that we weren't going to collect applique quilts. And the reason for that was applique quilts, the earliest quilts, were not, contrary to some of the romantic writing about American quilts, they were not made out of necessity. They were not made in a desperate situation to keep the family warm. The first quilts were made of what was then very expensive material that only wealthy families could afford, and they were meant for show. They didn't need them for warmth, and many of them were applique. And we were not disinterested in them because of that, but they did not have the visual power for us that piece quilts did. So we made a conscious decision not to invest our funds in applique quilts when we wanted to form a significant body of piece quilts. And I want to talk about this crazy quilt phenomenon. Here's a woman who did an absolutely brilliant job of making, again, to show how different patterns could be used in different ways. Here she made crazy strips, then put the strips together, and the effect is wonderful. The visual effect is wonderful to see these contrasting things. There's another great crazy quilt on this wall that again shows you, it's combining a number of techniques. Here are those centering red patterns that she picked up from log cabin quilts that she's used to center the crazy. So when we saw that, we said, okay, this one works. We didn't like crazy quilts at first. We thought, all right, this one's got it. Each square is just beautifully designed, and you could just take one of these squares and blow it up and put it on the wall and be very happy like that one. It's just gorgeous. And you'll notice that she has, this was Victorian fancy stitching. This is called turkey foot. And the edge of every piece has been overlaid with this fancy stitching. I don't like to think of how long that took her to do. And then one more crazy quilt on the platform here, which again is one of everyone's favorites, and it also was one of our favorites. It just uses up, this truly uses up scraps from clothes making, and has a kind of pink border, but the squares are fabulous. And again, this one makes a really powerful overall painting that was similar to what was being done in New York during this period, and the things we were seeing in our friends' studios. So this one was a must-have. I wanted to just say something about scale. Here you see that same idea we saw in an earlier quilt of the optical illusion that's formed by dark, medium, and light blocks. But in this case, instead of blocks this big, the women made the blocks this big. And it works just as well. It's just a different kind of painting. And so as we began to realize that, we began to look for different examples of scale of the same design. And here again is the same thing. Look at the size of the squares on this log cabin quilt, which she's centered with black rather than red or blue or any of the other ones we saw. The scale is phenomenal. I'll stand next to it so you can see what the scale is. And took forever to make, sat here day after day after day, making these tiny blocks and then piecing them together. But the point is that the basic design can be made this big or this big, and it still works visually. And that was a great discovery that American quilt makers made.